I'm very pleased to welcome you to this Reynolds-Finley lecture, the first of our series after the endowment of Dr. Wayne Finley in the audience there. Good to see you, Dr. Finley.
Thank you.
And
Good to be here.
we're very excited about the endowment and the renaming, and we're ready to move forward. So it's very exciting. Today, our speaker is William J. Benjamin. Many of you know him as Joe Benjamin. He is Director of Advanced Refractive Services at the Alabama Eye Cataract Center, incorporating Michelson Laser Vision, Inc. in the UAB Highlands building. He is also President of Material Performance Assessments, a corporation that became operational on October 1st, 2014, located in Hoover, Alabama. Dr. Benjamin obtained 4 degrees, all from Ohio State University, culminating in his PhD in 1982. And by the way, he does have, after the lecture, a very good Woody Hayes story. In any case, in former lives, he was director of the Institute of Contact Lens Research at the University of Houston. He's been a tenured professor of optometry and vision sciences at the UAB School of Optometry, also director of his eye physiology and ocular prosthetics laboratory, a senior scientist at the UAB's Science Research Center, and director of the Clinical Eye Research and interim chair of UAB's Department of Optometry, director of the professional program, and associate dean. So he's been quite busy here on campus and now off campus. Dr. Benjamin became interested in Lewis and Clark when he read Stephen Ambrose's Undaunted Courage some 20 years ago. That sparked his interest in his own exploration, namely the Lewis and Clark journals. It was there, reading the eyewitness accounts of the journey day by day, that he discovered how eye care got the party to the West Coast and back alive again. And now we're going to learn more about it too, as Dr. Benjamin presents Lewis and Clark, first eye care practitioners west of the Mississippi.
So can you hear this?
Yep.
Is it out there? Okay. So I'm going to try to convince you today that Lewis and Clark were in fact the first eye care practitioners west of the Mississippi. And in doing so, we're going to look at a number of different things. One, we're going to look at how Meriwether Lewis prepared to treat sore eyes, occasionally misspelled sore eyes, as they are in the journals, and that's a cute little thing that's happened. Actually, he could spell pretty well. It was William Clark that couldn't spell that well. He's got a number of nice misspellings in the journal. But we're also going to try to convince you that provision of eye care created goodwill up and down the Missouri River and allowed them to pass through that country relatively unmolested. Now, there were some tight instances that they had, but if they did not have the eye care that they were dispensing, they would have had a harder time getting through the country. So they had more friendly relations with the Indian tribes because of the eye care, and positively exposed the technological capacity of the young United States to the Indians along the river. So basically, they wanted to do that because they had competition from the British and the Spanish in the minds of the Native Americans, and they wanted to tell them, hey, look, we've got this extra technological capacity. And it turned out, they didn't really predict this, but it turned out that eye care was one of them. The eye care that they provided had the greatest medical impact, benefited the highest number of Native people over the largest possible region that they could possibly contact. And it turns out that's the case. On the return, eye care was traded for food and provisions that were in scarce supply, without which the expedition would have starved or been lost. Delivery of eye care was a major one of several factors that were necessary for the expedition to return to St. Louis. Not only successful, but alive. And along the way, in this presentation, we'll learn of a few other interesting eye-related aspects of the Lewis and Clark expedition. So, in the journals, when they recapped what happened during the day, they'd often say, we proceeded on. That's the way they started out the journal, telling about that day. We proceeded on. So let's proceed on to the topics at hand. Well, when the plan was formulated for the Lewis and Clark expedition, the Louisiana Territory belonged to France. And this expedition was going to be a clandestine, illegal intrusion into French land in 1804. But voila, Napoleon decided to sell the Louisiana Territory to the U.S. in 1803. It was very sudden. Jefferson's confidants in Paris were, they bought the land without even Jefferson knowing about it because they knew that he would want them to do so. And so in March of 1803, it was transferred over to the U.S. So when the Lewis and Clark expedition came about, it was actually a legal operation. They were traveling through lands that belonged to the United States. But yet, they were against the interests of Britain to the north, in Canada, Spain a little bit to the south, and the Native American allies of Britain and Spain. They did prepare for the journey for a long time. Actually, their lives were somewhat preparation for the journey. Both Clark and Lewis, they served with Anthony Wayne. Anthony Wayne's the fellow that floated down the Ohio River, started out an army in Cincinnati area today, and they went north from there, and they went over land that they had never been over before. And so Lewis and Clark knew how to operate in a military fashion, going through unknown territory, just as what they were going to do on the Lewis and Clark expedition down the Missouri River, or up the Missouri River to begin with. So Lewis was a more thoughtful, introspective person, while Clark kind of knew how to get things done, and they worked together really well, and they already knew that. The fact is, Lewis actually reported to Clark in Anthony Wayne's operation. But now the situation was reversed, but Lewis took Clark on as a co-command rather than making him a subordinate. Lewis then, Thomas Jefferson wanted to explore this land, and he recognized that Lewis could do this, and so he made him his aide for 2 years, and he instilled in him an intellectual curiosity about the West and how to expand westward. And so therefore, Lewis knew what the president wanted, and he was introduced to key figures in the federal government. But the overall plan of this operation was not only to discover things out in the West, the president wanted to know about the plants, wanted to know about the animals, the fish. He wanted to know about the Indian tribes in particular because they didn't know much about them. And because they wanted to develop friendships with these various Indian tribes up and down the Missouri River, he wanted to develop a fur trade where he envisioned that the Indian tribes would actually collect the furs, and this would give them an economic incentive to join with the white settlers moving out at some point, and they would economically be able to survive together. And this is what he hoped would happen. So it was Lewis and Clark's intent to go out and make friends with anybody they could make friends with. That was their job. And they needed also to find a route to the West Coast. Well, so Lewis prepared 2 years in advance of the spring of 1804 for this journey. And the main thing I wanted to talk about was how he interned for 3 weeks with Dr. Benjamin Rush in Philadelphia. Rush was a physician. Lewis needed to know how to take care of the health care of his men, and so he spent 3 weeks here interning with Rush in order to do so. But he also did a lot of other things during this 2-year period. He obtained a bunch of essential gear, arms, power, lead in Pennsylvania. He collected all those at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia. That was the Southern Arsenal and Armory. And he then took his stuff on June 9th, 1803, out to Pittsburgh by wagon. Pittsburgh was the highest you could go on the Ohio River by boat. So he wagoned the stuff to Pittsburgh, put it on the boat, floated it down to Ohio, went up the Missouri to St. Louis. But somewhere in there, he attended the transfer of Louisiana to St. Louis on March 3rd. There was a transfer ceremony and he was there. Well, my intention is to cover eye care. And it's kind of strange, I'll be talking a little bit about malaria. Everybody on the frontier had malaria. And it has some eye consequences. And so if you look at this, you'll see a quote here by Meriwether Lewis on July 16, 1806. The mosquitoes continue to infest us all in such a manner that we can scarcely exist. My dog even howls with the torture from these mosquitoes. And then John Ordway is a guy that wrote a journal on his own. The mosquitoes and small flies are very troublesome. My face and eyes are swelled by the poison of these insects, which bite very severe indeed. William Clark, last night, the mosquitoes was so troublesome that, look at his spelling, that no one of the party slept till half the night. For my part, I didn't sleep 1 hour. Those tormenting insects are not less numerous or troublesome this morning. This is in spite of the fact that they had mosquito netting. I guess their netting wasn't too good. The mosquitoes got through it in the evening. The child of Charbonneau, which is actually Sacagawea's baby. The child of Charbonneau has been so much bitten by mosquitoes that his face is much puffed up and swelled. And then my favorite of all these mosquito quotes, the mosquitoes was so numerous that I could not keep them off my gun long enough to take sight. You couldn't see his front sight. So this is emphasizing that everybody on this mission, just about probably, and everybody on the frontier had malaria. And they treated it with what is called Peruvian bark. In the Andes, it was discovered by the Incas that if they ate Peruvian bark, this bark from the cinchona tree, that they called quina quina, they would be better off in terms of their malaria. They didn't know why that occurred. The active ingredient quinine was not known until 1845. But this became the treatment for malaria. They ground it up, put it in their food, they ground it up, put it in their drink, and that's how they got it into their system. Now, quinine has some ocular side effects. And today, we actually still use derivatives of quinine. We use chloroquine, but mostly hydroxychloroquine is what is used today. These are successive distillations of the original quinine that have less side effects. So if these have less side effects, the actual Peruvian bark or quinine would have had much more in terms of side effects. And they have ocular side effects. Today they're used for malaria, they're used for lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. And they have ocular side effects. In fact, if you're on Plaquenil, which is hydroxychloroquine, you're supposed to get checked up about every 6 months by your eye doctor in order to make sure you don't get some retinal toxicity. So here we have in the center a photo by Dr. Melanie Sibley of the School of Optometry. This is a corneal whorl pattern that's typical of chloroquine toxicity, and it happens also with Plaquenil. And it also happens in cases of Fabry disease and some other types of medications. But the one that we're feared of is maculopathy or retinal toxicity, which actually is a permanent change in your vision. It can actually really degrade your vision. That's why you're getting checked up every 6 months if you have to be on Plaquenil therapy. So if these people were eating Peruvian bark on a chronic basis, there's probably a fair number of them that would have had some decreased vision due to Plaquenil toxicity. Well, not Plaquenil, but chloroquine, or quinine toxicity. So Dr. Benjamin Rush was the guy that had him take some of this on the expedition. And basically, he was a well-known principal of the American Revolution. He was the most well-known physician in the U.S. at the time. He started out at the College of Philadelphia, but when it became the University of Philadelphia in 1791, he became professor at the Institutes and Practice of Medicine and Clinical Practice at the brand new medical school, the first in the United States. Now, we don't know what he really told Meriwether Lewis about treating the eye, because neither one of them ever said it. But he did have lecture materials, and the primary one I would talk about is by Sydenham. Sydenham published the primary textbook of medicine at the time. It was originally published in 1676, and it was the primary text of medicine for over 150 years. So at this time, that was the primary text of medicine. It was originally printed in Latin, but Benjamin Rush thought so much about it that he actually was the guy that translated it into English so he could use it in his courses. And all of these texts that he drew from considered an inflammation of the eye. They called it ophthalmia. You and I might call it sore eye. The Lewis and Clark certainly called it sore eye. So everything that hurt the eye must have had a common effect on the eye, they thought. And so they were treating primarily sore eyes around down. That's all they knew about. And they had a shotgun approach to actually treating it. Now, Lewis and Clark were supposed to observe, record, and catalog, and they also wanted to observe, record, and catalog things about the Indian population. And basically, their own party had more sore eyes or inflammations than inspected. Here he has, Meriwether Lewis says, sore eyes is a common complaint among the party. And then John Ordway says, several in the party have sore eyes and are unable to work. And then this one by Clark, a very singular disorder is taking place amongst our party, that of sore eyes. 3 of the party had their eyes inflamed and swelled in such a manner as to render them extremely painful, particularly when exposed to the light, and the eyeball is much inflamed and the lid appears burnt with the sun. The cause of this complaint of the eye I can't account for. They actually reassigned boat assignments on this basis because these guys couldn't oar their way down the river. So, but the Indians that they fell in contact with were even much more afflicted with eye maladies. And here we have the Indians on these waters. This is by Clark. The Indians on these waters, sore eyes are common, and many have lost their eyes. Some one and many both. And Captain Clark observed several persons at both sexes who appeared to have arrived at great age, yet they appeared perfectly healthy, but most of them were perfectly blind. I observed an Indian woman who visited us yesterday, blind of an eye, and a man who was nearly blind of both eyes. The loss of sight I observed to be more common among all the nations inhabiting this river than among any people I have ever observed. They have almost invariably sore eyes at all stages of life. The loss of an eye is very common among them. Blindness in persons of middle age is by no means uncommon, and is almost invariably a concomitant of old age. I know not what cause to attribute the prevalent deficiency of the eye. They couldn't figure out what was causing it, but look at all the eye problems that were there. Many sore eyes. So it becomes important to look at how Dr. Benjamin Rush actually taught Lewis how to treat sore eye. But we don't really have any knowledge of what they actually did because they didn't tell us. But if you look at Sydenham, that textbook for 150 years, here's how Sydenham, and Rush thought this book was important because he translated it into English. Take of the distilled waters of plantain, roses, and frog spawn, each an ounce. A prepared titty, which is zinc oxide, reduced to a powder a gram. Mix them for an eye water, of which let a few drops be dropped into the eyes twice every day. And at night, give a quieting drop and an ounce of syrup of white poppies. If I could give syrup of white poppies, I'd have patients lined up outside the building. I mean, it's too bad that I can't do that. But I know what you're thinking. I know you're thinking you would never put anything like frog spawn anywhere near your eye. You're thinking that. And all I got to say is, back in this day, if your eye really hurt and it was swole shut and you couldn't sleep at night because it hurt so bad and you were afraid that you might go blind in that eye, you would let your doctor put some frog spawn on your eye. That's all I got to say. So let's look at another passage. Thatcher, he was a student of Rush, and he wrote about treating ophthalmia. Okay, he probably added a few things that Rush taught him, but we probably have somehow in here, we have what Rush might have taught him. Ophthalmia may be easily cured by means of a low diet. I guess you're not going to eat much. Gentle purging of glauber salts. This was something, they took stuff that would just clean you out. I mean, glauber salts, you take that and you go into the bathroom. Of course, there were no bathrooms, so I don't. And removing any extraneous body that may have insinuated itself beneath the eyelid. Now they're talking about foreign bodies. After which, the eye should be repeatedly washed with a decoction of marshmallow flowers or leaves boiled in new milk, and then covered with a soft emollient poultice made of the mucilage of slippery elm bark and crumbs of bread, or of linseed alone, including in small bags of fine muslin. The inflammatory stage by the above treatment will cease in 4 or 5 days, when an astringent chlorium of sulfate of zinc will soon complete the cure. That'll do it, won't it? And I know exactly what you're thinking. Again, you're thinking you would never put any mucilage of slippery gum board. But having already established that you put rubber spawn on your arm, this is not that big of a deal. Well, let's look at products today. Refresh Celluvis. Here is a product that all optometry students use to do gonioles. And patients use it. I pick up a box. I mean, I actually use this stuff myself. And can you see what the main ingredient is up there? Can you read that? Let me read it for you. It says mucilage of slippery elm bark. And down here, we got a whole bunch of, we have a whole spawn of other slippery mucomimetic polysaccharide eye lubricants that are in the products of other companies. And so basically, you thought that there was no way you'd put anything like this in your eye at all. But guess what? You already have. So here is, we often say, I'm going to advise you to do exactly what I would advise my son and daughter to do. So here's Rush. He writes a letter to his son about how to take care of his sore eye. And he's got in there, wash them at the same time frequently with cold water. When the inflammation is a little reduced, wash them in a solution of a scruple of sugar of lead in a common-sized teacup full of water or green tea. Actually, they had green tea back then. But the key here is the sugar of lead. I'm going to pick up on that later. And then Rush actually published a recipe for eye water. White vitriol, which is zinc sulfate, 1 ounce. Sugar of lead, lead acetate, 4 scruples. And then snow-melted water or spring water. It was cold, so it probably reduced inflammation because it was cold. But also, it's probably a more pure form of water you could get back in those days. So here's the ingredients of 4 different eye waters in the American New Dispensary in 1810. This is just a few years later. Notice over here, they have Rush's ingredients in the eye water there. He was famous as a physician in the New World at the time. These other ingredients, notice they have tincture of opium. Here's another laudanum, which is also tincture of opium. So they're using tincture of opium as a corneal anesthetic, topical anesthetic. Now back then they probably didn't know if you continued to use this on a chronic basis, it ruined your epithelium and made things actually worse after a while. They just put it in the eye in the beginning that probably felt better, so they used it, but they didn't know any better. But the one on the bottom right is the one that Rush would have recommended anyway. So here's the supplies that were acquired by Lewis in 1803. Turkish opium. Now you got the good opium, the Turkish stuff. Tincture of opium, and they had some antiseptics. Peruvian bark was used as an antiseptic. Mercury ointment, saltpeter, potassium nitrate, which actually is an ingredient for gunpowder. It was known on the frontier. If you got an injury, a bleeding injury or something like that, you poured gunpowder on it. That was an antiseptic. So saltpeter as must be the component of gunpowder is actually an antiseptic. But here's the astringents. Sugar of lead optic. The word optic was specifically in the list of stuff he got for the eye. So that is known that was actually for the eye. Then he had zinc sulfate. He had calamine ointment for the lids, possibly. So what do we think that Lewis was going to use? Well, he was going to use cold water, spring water, or snow-melted water if he could get it. He would administer eye water made of zinc sulfate, lead acetate, and a mixture of the water that he was able to get. And he had these other things in the background in reserve. There is a place in the journal where Lewis says, for sore eyes, there's that SOAR again. For sore eyes, I use a solution of white vitriol and a sugar of lead in the proportion of 2 grains of the former and 1 of the latter to each ounce of water. So he actually confirms there that what we think he was going to use, what Rush would have taught him, is actually what he was using in many cases. Wow, look at what we got today. Visine, over here, Visine AC has zinc sulfate in it. Clear eyes, zinc sulfate in it has astringents. So I don't know, have we come that far today? I have no idea. Okay, well, let me take a side trip here on an ocular incident that occurred with Pierre Cruzat. This doesn't have any bearing on sore eyes, but it is a nice ocular-related incident that occurred. Pierre Cruzat is a nearsighted in one eye, blind in the other eye guy, and he was a boatman originally. And he, of course, had no glasses or spectacles, and of course he had no contact lenses, because they weren't invented then. And he had probably the potential effects of retinal toxicity from Peruvian bark. But in the journal, Clark says, this Cruzat is nearsighted and has the use above one eye. He is an attentive, industrious man and one whom we both place greatest confidence during the whole route. Well, so, you know, Cruzat has this visual problem. On the way upstream, he was the boatman. He was hired to go to Fort Mandan in North Dakota where they wintered, and he was going to be let go with about 7 or 8 other guys hired for the same reason. But he was such a hard worker and a good boatsman that they decided to go ahead and keep him on the mission. So he helped them get all the way to Missouri, to the Rocky Mountains. And going downstream, though, they didn't need so many boatmen, so he became a hunter. Now, this is probably a mistake, because you got this half-blind guy running around with a rifle. Okay, so something's going to happen, right? Well, it actually did. So he hunted going downstream with one of the short rifles, and this is a short rifle here. This was a special model picked up by Lewis at Harper's Ferry. They were just about to initiate mass production of them, and it's thought that Lewis picked up 15 early examples of this rifle. So it was the first military rifle for the U.S. military that was mass produced by the government. And Stephen Ambrose said they were the sine qua non of the expedition. Upon them depended the food supply and self-defense. Henry Dearborn, Secretary of War, when he ordered the guns to be produced, I've had such convincing proof of the advantage of short rifles over the long ones in actual service, as they have no doubt favoring the short rifle with larger caliber than the long ones usually have. So these existed before he actually ordered their production, and so it is believed that Lewis actually got these things. Now, the long rifle was the quintessential rifle of its day, and visually, the reason it's a little more accurate is because it has a longer barrel and the sight radius is longer. So that's a little eye-related pearl there. But it didn't matter to Cruzat. He didn't have the vision to make use of a long rifle anyhow. So he was an accident waiting to happen. And he shot his commanding officer. On August 11th, 1806, they were floating down the river with the current. They saw some elk, they needed some food, so he and Meriwether Lewis got off to shoot each one of them an elk for the party. And Meriwether Lewis was wearing buckskins. He probably looked like an elk to a guy that's blurred. And he's about to pull the trigger on an elk, and he gets shot from a pace of about 40, from a spot about 40 yards away. You can tell this by the report of the gun. But he's not really thinking about looking for who shot him right then, because he got shot. And the next day, William Clark, who wasn't in camp at the time, he came back. He was the medical guy of the expedition. He looked, and this is his clinical assessment of the wound. I examined the wound and found it a very bad flesh wound. The ball had passed through the fleshy part of his left thigh below the hip bone and cut the cheek of the right buttock for 3 inches in length and the depth of the ball. So I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Cruzat, he shot his commanding officer in the butt. Only you're thinking the A word. And I don't think it's Alabama either. He did. That's where he shot him. And so, of course, Cruzat, he denies everything. He runs back through the bushes there and gets back without anybody seeing him. And so actually Lewis thought maybe an Indian might have come up and shot him, because somebody out there that they didn't know about. But he says he looked at the ball. The ball had lodged in my breeches, of which I knew to be the ball of the short rifle, such as that The short rifles were 54 caliber. No other gun out there was 54 caliber, so you got shot by a gun that only Cruzat could have been out there and Pratt changed his story. He said, well, if I did it, it wasn't intentional. He didn't get court-martialed because they thought it was an accident, and he had been a really good worker before him. Lewis had to lie on his front in the canoe and just have his head up looking at what's going on downstream because he couldn't sit on his rear. And it hurt so bad. And then he actually slept in the canoe on his front overnight for about a month. So let's go on to sore eyes after that interlude. It was an eye-related interlude. So anyhow, they're supposed to make friends and show the technology in the United States, and Lewis and Clark became the eye care providers, especially on the return trip. Here is a quote. We gave them some eye water, which I believe will, oh boy, I'm going to have to get my glasses out on this one. Will render them more essential service than any other article in the medical way, which we had it in our power to bestow on them. Sore eyes seem to be a serious universal complaint among these people. So what's Clark saying is, of all the medical stuff they got, their eye water and their eye care is the main thing that they have to offer these people. Our officers washed their eyes and gave them medicine and told them how to apply it, etc. My friend Captain Clark is a favorite physician and has already received many applications. Clark would actually have them lined up outside the camp to do eye care. Much in need, the Indians were so impressed and expended considerable effort on occasion to reach the expedition to get their eyes treated. There was a funny occurrence they had with their medical care, which I could go into, but I don't want to. But this occurrence added to the benefit of which many of them experienced from the eye water we gave them, has given them an exalted opinion of our medicine. And then over here on the right, at noon we were visited by 4 Indians who informed us they had come from their village on Lewis's River at a distance of 2 days' ride in order to see us and obtain a little eye water. Captain Clark washed their eyes and set out on the return to the village. Our skill and virtue of our medicines has been spread, it seems, to a great distance. So this is the effort that some Indians were expending to get their eyes treated. On the way back, Lewis and Clark didn't have much left in terms of provisions and food, and so they traded their eye care for provisions and food. We passed an Indian man who gave Captain Clark a very elegant gray mirror for which he requested a vial of eye water, which was accordingly given. This Indian thought 1 vial of eye water was worth a horse. Horses were important in that time on the frontier. I was busily employed for several hours this morning in administering eye water to a crowd of applicants. We once more obtained a plentiful meal, much to the comfort of all the party. The whole party got a meal, because they were treating the eye care of the Indians at their camp that night. And it says once more, so they did this more than just once. Eye care was used in diplomacy. Here are 2 passages, I won't go through them, but basically Clark and Lewis split the duties. Clark would go and treat the Indians' eyes, and here he says he had near 40 applicants with sore eyes. Captain Lewis said there was at least 50. Often they would take their journals and kind of rewrite them. So he looks like he took Clark's entry on this point and rewrote it in his own style. But basically, and then they gave a vial of eye water to one of the Indians that he with afterwards so he could treat the eyes of his own people. So, and they said, well, we'll supply you some more when we run out. So it was used in diplomacy. But when they started going into the Rocky Mountains, things were getting desperate. McNeil and York were sent on a trading voyage over the river this morning. Having exhausted all of our merchandise, we were obligated to have recourse to every subterfuge in order to prepare in the most ample manner in our power to meet that wretched portion of our journey, the Rocky Mountains, where hunger and cold in their most rigorous form assail the weary traveler. Not any of us have yet forgotten our sufferings in these mountains in September last. I think it probably never will. Well, in September last, they were going out, they had food, they had provisions, and they had the help of the Shoshone Indians getting over the Annapolis. Now they have none of that. They don't have anything left to trade. Our traders, McNeil and York, are furnished with the buttons which Captain Lewis and myself cut off our coats. They were officers and they had officers' coats and they had brass buttons on them. The other people didn't. They cut the brass buttons off their coats, added some eye water and some vials of eye water and some tin boxes. And in the evening, McNeil and York returned with about 3 bushels of roots and some bread, having made a successful voyage. This was as pleasing to us as the return of a good cargo to an East India merchant. So they were at the end of their rope. They had nothing to eat. They had provisions were low. They had to get something or they were going to starve. And so basically, this eye water and the treatment of eyes that they became known for, that and some brass buttons off the commander's coats were all that stood between the expedition and starvation in the Rocky Mountains. So I think I convinced you how important eye water and eye care was to the Lewis and Clark expedition. I think it was probably the second most important thing that allowed that expedition to survive. The most important thing is not eye related, but I will relate it to you because it is really good. And that is the tale of Sacagawea. Now you probably think that Sacagawea is the one that led them to the mountains and showed them the way through. And that couldn't be farthest from the truth. That's not what actually happened. She did not point the way. She was a Shoshone, having been taken as a young girl by a Mandan war party from North Dakota. So the Shoshones were out near the Rocky Mountains, right up next to it. And Lewis and Clark knew about the Shoshone. Her husband was Toussaint Charbonneau, a French fur trader, and her son was born February 11th, 1805. This is the winter when Lewis and Clark wintered with the Mandan party in North Dakota, going out. And in fact, William Clark being the medical kind of officer, he's the one that delivered the baby. There's 2 reasons that they wanted to take Sacagawea along. One, they were an armed party of 30 guys bristling with guns, and they were bound to get considered to be a threat going down up the river and back. And they didn't want to get in any fights because if they lost a few people, once they lost critical mass, they'd be just wiped out. So basically, they included Sacagawea and her baby as an indicator that they were not a war party, that they were actually a friendly group trying to establish relationships with the Indian tribes. But the main reason is they knew they had to make friends with the Shoshones next to the Rocky Mountains. The Shoshones had horses, and they needed those horses to get over the mountains and back from the Missouri River. And so it was imperative. They had to make friends with the Shoshones. There was no option they had to do it. And so Sacagawea knew Shoshone. So they included her along so she'd be able to translate once they got out to meet the Shoshone Indians. Then came the fateful day that they finally met up with the Shoshone. They were looking around for them next to the Rocky Mountains. They couldn't find them. Finally, they ran into the Shoshone Indians. The chief was a guy named Camelot. And they built a big bonfire, and they brought in all the meat. They shot a couple more elks, brought it in so they could have the chief and his entourage have dinner with them, and then they would go ahead and give them their spiel about how they should join up with the United States and all that. And basically, but they wanted to make friends because they had to have those horses, and they couldn't pay much for them because they didn't have much. They couldn't, I mean, if they paid everything they had, they wouldn't have anything to go on with. So they needed to, have a good rate as well. So Sacagawea comes in to translate. And at that point, one of the luckiest things I think ever happened in U.S. history happened. As she's talking, translating with Camelot between Lewis and Clark and the chief and her realize that they are brother and sister. And they have a tearful reunion. both of them crying next to the fire. And it turns out that Lewis and Clark went from being a threat, a group that maybe the Shoshone would not let through their territory, a group they were suspicious of, to the group that had brought back from captivity the chief's long-lost sister. Well, guess what? They got their horses free. The heavy items they couldn't take over the mountains, they were buried, stored, and the Shoshone protected them from theft until they got back. And a Shoshone scout was assigned to lead them over and through the Rocky Mountains. They had no idea how to get through. And the Shoshone assigned somebody to show them how to get through. This has to be, in my estimation, one of the luckiest events in all U.S. history. And it was so vital to the success of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And that's why I think it outweighs the Eye Care in terms of its importance. So what did we learn over the last 45 minutes? We learned Meriwether Lewis anticipated the treatment of sore eyes, but could not have predicted how important that would be. We learned that provision of eye care created goodwill, resulting in passage, relatively unmolested, in more friendly relations with the Indian tribes, and positively exposed the technological capacity of the young United States. They wanted to compare favorably with Britain and Spain. In fact, Spain actually sent an expedition up to try to intercept Lewis and Clark, but they lost them, they never found them. Eye care had the greatest medical impact, benefited the highest number of native people over the largest possible region that they could have expected to entertain. And on the return, eye care was traded for food and provisions that were in scarce supply, without which the expedition would have starved or been lost. Delivery of eye care was a major one of several factors that were necessary for the expedition to return to St. Louis successful and alive. And on our journey, we learned that a visual accident waiting to happen. Well, it happened. And we learned that one of the luckiest events in all history happened during the Lewis and Clark expedition. So I think I've convinced you all that Lewis and Clark were, in fact, the first eye care practitioners west of the Mississippi. But I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, were Lewis and Clark optometrists, or were they ophthalmologists? Well, and at the Alabama Eye Cataract Center, we've been discussing this. I'm outvoted there 2-1. But we unanimously decided that today, one of them would be destined to become an optometrist and the other would be destined to become an ophthalmologist. And it was only through practicing multidisciplinary eye care at the highest level at that time that they were able to go to the West Coast and return to St. Louis alive. And I want to thank you very much for listening.